For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Russia's Victory Day parade on Red Square was held without military hardware on display. Given how central World War II mythology is to modern Russia's projection of power, both at home and abroad, this marks a significant shift. The Kremlin's official explanation is the growing threat posed by Ukrainian drone attacks, which have recently become increasingly effective, reaching deep into Russian territory, settling oil refineries ablaze for days, and even striking central Moscow, just kilometers from the Russian Defense Ministry and the Kremlin itself. For decades, Victory Day parade served as a message for the world that Russia is a military superpower, but is it still? Hello, I'm Katarina Godunova, reporting from our new studio in Kyiv and filling in today for Anna Bilakur, who is on a well-deserved vacation. Today we'll take a closer look at what's behind Ukraine's recent successes in the air, the growing challenges Moscow faces in the 5th year of the full-scale invasion, and what all of this could mean for where this war is headed. Before we go any further in exploring the big question of this episode, let me first explain why we place so much emphasis on this single day, Victory Day. It's because of how much it matters and always has mattered to Russia. Although the initial surrender of Nazi Germany was signed on the 7th of May in 1945, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin insisted that Germany signs the surrender again in Berlin, this time with participation of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, to emphasize the Soviet Union's central role in defeating Nazi Germany. Because the signing took place late at night on May the 8th in Europe, it was already May the 9th in Moscow by the time the surrender officially took effect. This is why most European countries, including Ukraine, mark Victory Day on May the 8th, while Russia commemorates it separately on the following day. Russia also uses its own term, the Great Patriotic War, emphasizing the Soviet Union's struggle as distinct from the broader global conflict. Russia's approach to Victory Day is also markedly different from the approaches of most European countries. Across much of Europe, the date is primarily focused on remembrance, mourning, and reconciliation. In Russia, however, it has evolved into a powerful state-centered narrative built around the Soviet Union's great victory over Nazism and its supposedly unique role in securing it. During the Soviet era, the narrative was used to legitimize and glorify Soviet power, while overshadowing the regime's crimes against its own population. In modern Russia, the memory of World War II has increasingly become a political tool used to mobilize society around a more aggressive military agenda, including the ongoing war against Ukraine. The Kremlin continues to frame the invasion through the language of fighting Nazism in Ukraine, tying it directly to the World War II struggle, despite there being no real parallels. Ukrainians fought side by side with Russians against Nazi Germany and paid an enormous price themselves, losing millions of lives. But let's return to Victory Day and its main spectacle, the military parade on Red Square, traditionally used by the Kremlin to showcase Russia's military power, unveil new weaponry, and impress both domestic audiences and foreign guests with displays of scale. This year, however, the picture looked noticeably different. As early as the 28th of April, Russia's Defense Ministry announced that heavy military equipment would not take part in the parade. Students from military academies and cadet corps were also excluded from the event. At the same time, Victory Day celebrations were cancelled altogether in several major Russian cities, as well as in occupied Crimea. That explanation is also supported by Ukrainian military intelligence, which said that in the days leading up to the 9th of May, Russia redeployed air defense systems from other regions to reinforce security around Moscow, effectively leaving other parts of the country less protected to secure the parade. The Russian president himself appeared to reveal the Kremlin's concerns when he unilaterally announced a ceasefire with Ukraine for May the 8th and the 9th. Since 2022, Russia has repeatedly announced temporary ceasefires during religious and symbolic holidays in attempt to halt Ukrainian attacks, while continuing its own military operations against Ukraine. So it is hardly surprising that few in Ukraine took the proposal seriously, especially since the offer was never communicated through official channels, according to Kyiv. President Volodymyr Zelensky instead suggested that the ceasefire begin on the 6th of May, challenging Putin to prove that he cared about anything beyond the Victory Day parade.
Росія отримала від нас чітку пропозицію щодо тиші та дипломатії і знає, як зв'язатись з Україною або з партнерами, щоб узгодити деталі. Якщо ж ту одну особу в Москві, яка не може жити без війни, цікавить тільки один парад і більше нічого, то це інша справа.
When it became clear that Ukraine would not accept the proposal, Moscow reverted to the good old threats, with Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova issuing this wild statement.
4 мая 2026 года Министерство обороны Российской Федерации опубликовало официальное заявление в связи с угрозами киевского режима нанести удар по Москве в священный для всех россиян праздник День Победы в Великой Отечественной войне. МИД России настоятельно призывает власти вашей страны, руководство вашей организации с максимальной ответственностью отнестись к данному заявлению и обеспечить заблаговременную эвакуацию из города Киев персонала дипломатических и иных представительств, а также граждан в связи с неотвратимостью нанесения вооруженными силами Российской Федерации ответного удара по Киеву, в том числе по центрам принятия решений в случае реализации киевским режимом своих преступных террористических замыслов в дни празднования Великой Победы.
In reality, of course, the hostilities never stopped. Even after US President Donald Trump announced on the evening of May the 8th that Russia and Ukraine had agreed to a ceasefire from May the 9th to May the 11th, a claim both sides publicly confirmed, hostilities continued. Overnight into May the 9th, Ukraine came under attack from Russian long-range drones. Throughout the day, Russian strikes causing casualties were reported in regions near the front line. The parade in Moscow itself turned out to be one of the shortest in history, lasting just 45 minutes. On the day of the parade, Russian authorities effectively shut down central Moscow. Shops and cafes were closed, while internet and mobile service barely worked, reportedly due to heightened security measures. Alongside Russian troops fighting in Ukraine, North Korean soldiers who took part in the Kursk offensive marched across Red Square. The parade concluded with a flyover by Su-25 attack aircraft, despite earlier reports suggesting the Kremlin might cancel the aerial portion because of concerns over possible Ukrainian attacks. The number of foreign guests was also noticeably smaller this year. Leaders from Belarus, Laos and Malaysia attended the parade, along with representatives of the Russian-occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico arrived in Moscow the day before, but did not take part in the event itself. Russia invests enormous resources into projecting strength and control. Our job is to look beyond the spectacle and report on what is actually happening. Like many of my colleagues at the Kyiv Independent, I work from our office in Kyiv to bring you reporting from Ukraine as the war unfolds. This work is only possible thanks to our community of more than 29,000 members who support us every month. If you value our work, please consider supporting us by joining our community. You can find the link in the description below. Russia, whose territory is roughly 28 times larger than Ukraine's and whose mobilization potential is estimated at around 20 million people, has spent years cultivating the image of itself as a military superpower, a status typically associated with the United States and China. But what exactly is a superpower? The term was first introduced by William Fox in 1944 during World War II. He defined it as a state, at the time including the United States, the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom, capable of projecting power globally and influencing or defeating other major powers, without suffering unsustainable losses in the process. But the era of World War II and of the Soviet Union is long gone, so what defines a military superpower today? There is no single definition, but researchers generally agree on several key indicators. First, a combat-ready military capable of rapidly deploying forces anywhere in the world. Second, a full nuclear triad, land, air and sea-based delivery systems. Third, advanced weapon systems, along with the industrial capacity to produce and scale them. And finally, a strong economic foundation capable of sustaining long-term military power. While the United States and China broadly meet this criteria as the world's two largest economies and leading military powers, Russia raises more complicated questions, and not only when it comes to its wartime economy. Ukraine's war against Russia is often described as a modern David versus Goliath struggle, the self-proclaimed second strongest army in the world, facing a force that in 2014 numbered around 250,000 troops, with only a fraction considered combat-ready. At that time, much of Ukraine's military equipment was outdated and largely inherited from Soviet-era stockpiles. Looking back at the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, there was genuine uncertainty about how events would unfold and whether Kyiv would still be under Ukrainian control the next day. But since then, Ukraine has repeatedly challenged the perception of Russian military superiority, from successfully defending Kyiv to liberating Kharkiv Oblast in the east and Kherson in the south, to briefly seizing Russian territory in Kursk Oblast, crippling much of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and ultimately carrying out the unprecedented Operation Spiderweb, which reportedly destroyed 41 Russian military aircraft. But there is one area where Ukraine has arguably achieved its greatest success: air warfare. Going from virtually no long-range strike capability in 2022 to developing its own fleet of deadly drones and missiles, Ukraine is now hitting Russia where it hurts, deep inside territories that until recently seemed completely untouchable. President Volodymyr Zelensky said in February that around 450 companies are now involved in drone production in Ukraine, calling it the country's largest industrial sector. And it is thanks to long-range drones that Ukraine is now striking at one of the core pillars of the Russian economy, its oil industry, and doing so with increasing effectiveness. In late April and early May alone, Ukrainian drones struck Russia's Tuapse oil refinery 4 times, with estimated damages reaching around $300 million. And this is just one example in Ukraine's broader long-range drone campaign. But does this mean Ukraine now holds a real advantage in long-range strike capabilities? And can Russia still adapt? We put these questions to Mykola Beleskov, a research fellow at the National Institute for Strategic Studies and a senior analyst at the Ukrainian NGO Come Back Alive. At this point, does Ukraine have an advantage over Russia in long-range drone strikes?
Well, I would put situation in a little bit different way. So we are not talking about advantage right now. We are talking about leveling the field. Because if we compare the starting positions and the situation we had like in 2022, 2023, up maybe to the last year, there was a huge disadvantage in long-range so-called strategic strikes, which favored Russia. So Russia was able to target theoretically any part of Ukraine with cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, with UAVs, one-way attack UAVs, while Ukraine was steadily building its capability. And in March 2026, we, for the first time during the big war between Ukraine and Russia, had a situation when Ukraine launched more one-way strategic UAVs against Russia than Russia launched the same type of UAVs against Ukraine. So it's about leveling the playing field to the extent possible, because Russia still enjoy advantage in a classical munition. It's still some time in progress before Ukraine can field mid-range cruise missiles, short-range ballistic missiles in numbers. But at least in terms of UAVs, we are now in a situation when not only Russia can attack Ukraine to the fullest possible extent, but also Ukraine can target European part of Russia, where most of the population, most of the centers of economic activities are concentrated.
How has Ukraine managed to scale up these operations, drone operations, so effectively? And what role have international partners played in it? And how much it was driven by Ukraine specifically and its defense industry?
First attempts to develop one-way attack UAVs were done in autumn 2022. Since the time we managed to field a couple of platforms. The most prominent ones which are mentioned are Luty UAV, also FP1 UAV. These are the ones responsible for the most of the damage. As far as I understand, there was certain aid in research and development and scale up out of our partners in terms of funding during 2024 out of US. And then for sure, a number of countries, like 11 countries, they support scaling up production of one-way strategic UAVs. So we know that Germany, for instance, joined this initiative in funding the scale up of production in July last year. Also, Sweden and Norway fund this production. So our partner aid was prominent both in development of these UAVs and also in scaling up of production of these UAVs.
When we look at Ukrainian successful strikes against Russian oil infrastructure, is it mainly due to gaps in Russian air defenses, or does it reflect the effectiveness actually of Ukrainian planning and Ukrainian operators?
It's also a complex story because there were reports like last year that the efficiency of the attacks which targeted oil processing was not as impressive as it might seem from the headlines. So the efficiency rate was maybe 5-10%. The fact that now we do more strikes and we damage oil processing, oil export, military industrial complex, so all type of targets that relate to Russian war effort, it explained by the number of things. So first, we managed to clear flight corridors for these UAVs, destroying by middle strikes Russian air defenses along the front line and also along the national border. We accumulated the data, a lot of data during 2024-2025, and we managed to improve tactics. And now, again, we have a natural advantage of attacker. Because like Russians, they each time choose other flight paths. We also choose another flight path, and you never know how next time Ukraine is going to attack, the direction of flight passes. And also simply the geography. Russia is simply too big and unprepared to this type of threat and has other tasks like protecting the frontline formations with classic air defense, or maybe delivering glide bombs using piloted aviation, not to shoot down Ukrainian UAVs, but to deliver glide bombs. So all these factors contribute to the recent uptick in attacks and successfulness of all these attacks.
What indicators show that these Ukrainian strikes are having a real, sustained, and painful impact on Russia, and specifically on its oil infrastructure?
That's a bit of challenge to properly calculate it, not to underestimate, but also not to overestimate. And Russians are also learning like Ukrainians. They tend not to publicize any kind of evidence for Ukrainians to assess. There were some reports that Ukrainian recent strikes cost Russia at least $7 billion of lost revenue if we are talking about oil processing. But again, we see the scale that is increasing. We see more and more evidence of increased attacks, and we received like very outright, straightforward statement out of Sergei Shoigu, made in March this year, of this secretary of the so-called Security Council, who said that right now at this point we can't guarantee like 100% security and protection of all of our major objects and sites in Russia. So it's very straightforward statement, because they simply can't deny that the tempo of Ukrainian attacks and the scale of Ukrainian attacks increased, and it has a real damage.
But we also know that throughout the war, Russia has continued to modernize its weapon systems and adapt to battlefield situation, and usually does it really fast. So are there any indicators that Russia is already improving its air defenses, and if so, in what kind of specific way?
There are certain reports, certain evidence that they want to improve so-called passive defense. So the physical countermeasures that would mitigate the warhead effects, basically. There were leaked presentations of Rosneft about how to protect oil processing facilities, basically. But overall, it's quite a challenging task. And we have an example of Germany in World War II that was attacked by US, UK strategic bombing campaign. And it was really resource consuming and human consuming. And even if Russia would decide to deflect a huge segment of its piloted aviation to shoot down UAVs, it means that they would have less piloted aviation to deliver glide bombs. It's about creating dilemmas that means that you don't have a simple solution. So whether Russians would adjust, yes, they would adjust. They would adjust both in a passive defense and passive countermeasures and more proactive countermeasures, kinetic, non-kinetic one. but it would be time consuming, it would be resources consuming, it would be human consuming. So that's the major point of these attacks, to deflect as much resources from the front line effort. And by this, to create more openings for instance, middle strike we are doing all along the front line, which again would create more openings for strategic strikes.
It now appears that Ukraine might have even achieved a degree of air parity with Russia. In March, Ukraine reportedly launched more drones against Russia than Russia launched against Ukraine, averaging around 237 drones per day. However, this alone is not a decisive measure of whether Russia retains its status as a military superpower. The assessment is far more complex, encompassing not only air capabilities, but also the overall readiness of its armed forces, the depth of its defense industrial base, and its ability to sustain prolonged military operations. Is there a broader trend suggesting that Russia's military power is weakening as the war in Ukraine continues? And what indicators can support or challenge that statement or view?
There are indicators that demonstrate problems with functioning of the Russia with this tempo of war. So we see that the deficit of their budget would be bigger. We see the tight labor market and the competition for limited human resources. We see the fact that overall Russia economy is not increasing as it was increasing in 2023, 2024. So the effect out of infusion of additional spending for the war effort is not as big as it was. So we see problems, we see contradictions increasing that should complicate decision making for the Russia. But there is a problem that unfortunately Vladimir Putin is not economic minded person. He is a geopolitics minded person, and he lived in his own world.
Can Russia still, in this case, be considered a military superpower today, or is that label increasingly contested?
Superpower is the one which can project its power all over the world. Definitely Russia is not superpower. We have only one superpower, which is US. Russia can't overwhelm Ukraine militarily quickly. It still doesn't mean that we shouldn't disregard Russia. Russia still has resources and capacity to generate problems. Putin thinks that in this game of willpower, in this contest of willpower, in long-term time worked for Russia. He thinks that democracies are weak, democracies are dysfunctional, democracies produce populist regimes. So the fact that Russia is not able to overwhelm Ukraine militarily, and especially on battlefields, their prospects are very bleak. It doesn't mean that we should disregard Russia. And the very fact that they are able to sustain this war for the fifth year straight. Yes, with the external aid, they rely on their own partners in economic terms, in terms of hardware, subcomponents. But the very fact that they are able to sustain such level of fighting means that they remain an important player. It doesn't mean that we should agree with their terms, but we shouldn't disregard Russia.
President Zelensky says that Ukrainian forces have taken the initiative on parts of the front line and regained control of certain territories. How accurate is this assessment based on available reporting, and does it reflect a sustained shift in momentum, or is it a more limited and localized development for Ukraine?
What we can say for sure that there was a number of adjustments out of Ukrainian defense forces to counter current Russian battlefield strategies. So we managed to compensate lack of manpower with unmanned ground platforms and do not risk humans to do resupply, to do medical evacuation. We made a huge progress in air defense relying on UAVs. And these UAVs, they destroy not only strategic Russian UAVs, but also battlefield UAVs, both reconnaissance and strike. And we also improved in middle strike campaign. So if we are talking about the battlefield, and also indirectly, we complicate for Russia the calculations using strategic strikes. So all this combined and resulted in the fact that Russia battlefield strategy is not producing added value, increased efficiency. So there is a plateau, it's possible to say, of Russian battlefield strategy as we know it, like relying on infiltration, relying on battlefield UAVs for interdiction and specifically disrupting medical evacuation and resupply. But we shouldn't overestimate also these facts. So there is a natural threat that we would overestimate them and take them for granted. So it's an ongoing race and it's ongoing adjustments, and we shouldn't take them for granted. So yes, we enter most intense period of fighting in 2026 more confident, unlike 2024, 2025. But we can take for granted by default all these achievements, and we've seen number of examples how Russians can adjust. And despite some successes, we still have some challenges, and the Russians still try to advance.
Over the past 4 years, Ukraine has significantly strengthened its defense industry, and this year in particular has sharply increased the intensity of its long-range strikes against Russia. Strikes that are now being felt directly by the Russian economy. But Russia still retains a large arsenal of powerful weapons, including missiles and Shahed-type drones, which continue to strike Ukraine daily. At the same time, missile launches in 2026 have increased compared to previous years, suggesting that Russia's defense industry has not only adapted to sanctions, but is also managing to scale production under pressure. On the ground, Russian forces remain entrenched along the front lines in Ukraine, where fighting continues at an intense pace over every meter of territory. So even if Russia is under strain, it is still too early to write it off. It remains a serious threat, not only to Ukraine and its immediate neighbors, but to European security as a whole.
Hi, this is Tim, an international politics reporter with the Kyiv Independent, and today we've got a question from our member asking what is the public perception of Russia's military capabilities inside Russia, and has the limited successes and high casualty rate in the invasion of Ukraine and or the troubles it faces with its economy and population demographics had any effect on the confidence of the Russian people in their country's ability to fight war. So, look, the main problem with the Russian society is that it doesn't really care about the war. We can see it in a lot of polls, they don't, let's put it like this, they don't touch the war in real life a lot. Of course, Ukraine launches drones on the Russian cities, but still it's more pointed now. And the majority of the Russian people, they don't see the war in the real life. At the same time, they get all the information about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine from the pro-government or state-owned sources. So those were important points to understand the context here. Why the Russians don't care about the war? They don't see the responsibility on the population for this war. They, like in any other autocracies, they believe that it's something their government is busy with. It's not their problem. If we talk about the trust in the army, it is pretty high in Russia. They do trust in the army, but still, it's according to state pollsters. I'm not sure how much we could believe in them because it's not that they like falsify the percentage. It's not like that. The people in the autocracies, they tend to agree with whatever their government is doing just to stay alive and not like go into prison. So we can't really look at those polls, but according to them, like 85% of the Russians, they trust in the army. At the same time, what I like to look into when it comes to like the Russian society is the opinion barometer of the population. When the pollsters ask the Russians whether they are worried at the moment, there are like polls like those, and those are interesting ones. And there was a tendency in 2022, the Russians got really worried about all the things when the Russian president announced his mobilization in September 2022. That was the period of like great unease in the Russian society. And now what we can see in May and April this year, the Russian population is getting more worried because the people in Russia, they are talking about a possible mobilization because basically Russia has no breakthrough on the front lines and the situation is stuck. So a lot of people started talking about a possible mobilization, and now the Russian people are more worried about this. So that's also a sign of how confident they are in their army. They see that there is no breakthrough. People start talking about possible mobilization, and the Russian people start apparently worrying. That's also an interesting aspect.
If you found this video useful, don't forget to like, leave a comment and subscribe. It helps us reach more people and spread the truth about Russia's war. Thanks for watching, see you soon on the Kyiv Independent YouTube channel.